Okay. Um, the presentation today is going to be the Battleship Oregon berthed at Portland. And, oh, okay. Tried to get something out of the way. I'm going to put it down at the bottom. And it generally follows an exhibit that I'll have at Sacramento that on covers and representations of the Battleship Oregon from 1925 to 1942, when she was a museum ship right here in Portland, Oregon. I technically live about 10 miles out of town. I'm in Beaverton. At one time in her day, Oregon was, I think, the most famous ship in the Navy fleet. Similar, I think, to how we know the Battleship Arizona. I think every school child knew the basic story of the Oregon, and she was much admired and revered during her career, mostly pertaining to her actions during the Spanish-American War. When the battleship Maine blew up in the harbor in February 1898, Oregon was on the West Coast up in Bremerton, and she received orders to go to Cuba to join the U.S. fleet there. So she got underway and famously went around the horn of South America and reached Cuba in 66 days, which was quite a feat at the time. And she was the hero of the Battle of Santiago in July of 1898. And shortly after that, she went back to the Pacific, spent several years with the Asiatic fleet there, and then in 1906 returned to Bremerton, where she was put in mothballs for about 5 years. When she came out of mothballs and back into commission in 1911, she had the cage mast that you see in the photo here. And it's easy to believe that that's the front of the ship with that big mast. But the bow and the stern of Oregon look very similar, and that's actually the stern. The main mast is on the other side, which is the front of the ship. And Oregon served up until 1919 in a minor way, always along the West Coast and in and out of San Francisco and Bremerton, and then finally was decommissioned for the final time in early October 1919. Because of her fame, she was much wanted by the state of Oregon as a museum ship, and they negotiated with the Navy for quite some time until 1925, when they finally reached an agreement. And when the ship was towed to, when the ship was towed to Portland, they timed it to coordinate with the Portland Rose Festival that was going on. And for items that depict the Oregon, these real photo postcards are just about the only thing you're going to find. And with some study, they kind of go in sequence. This first one up here is when Oregon was probably a couple miles from her normal mooring spot, just the day before the Rose Festival began. And then the second one below it here shows the Oregon approaching her mooring spot. And now you can see that there's a lot of people on board, including the Queen of the Rose Festival and the court and a bunch of other dignitaries. And then just recently I spotted this one too, which is just a little bit closer. And you can actually see the dolphins in the docking area as she's getting closer in. And you might wonder what this little thing is, and it's the mast of a tugboat. There were 2 tugs that brought her down from Seattle, and it's one of the 2. And in fact, even in this photo, there's just a little nib of something there, and that's the tip of the mast. They really carefully positioned their camera to avoid the tugboat, which I thought was kind of neat. She was moored at the base of the Broadway Bridge on the east side of the Willamette River. And here you can see the bridge, sometimes from an angle on the other side looking back toward the bridge, you can find the image of Oregon underneath. The bridge is kind of in front of you here, so that you're seeing the actual bow of Oregon here. And just last month, I walked out on the Broadway Bridge, which still exists. And I walked maybe to right about here and then turned around and started and took us some photographs. You can see the railroad tracks that match up with this. You can see this general area of green here would be where Oregon was moored. And so there's still, you can still see where she was. I tried to, in my mind, imagine seeing her there, but it was a little tough. As far as collectibles, the earliest item that I've run across, which Jay Malusky had, I was so grateful that he sold it to me, was this 1927 philatelic cover, self-addressed to Everett Earl, who was a collector down in the Bay Area. And the writing up here just says that if it's not delivered in 5 days, return to the Battleship Oregon, Portland, Oregon, and then it's postmarked in 1927. I think the person who wrote that was the curator of the Oregon, named Cora Thompson, who you're going to hear quite a bit about. The other early item that I think is connected to the Battleship Oregon in Portland are these commercial postcards. They're very similar. I'm not sure if they were available for sale on the ship or if they were given to visitors. There's some things there it's probably we're not going to know. One of them says number 1, and one of the visitor cards that you'll see in a minute says, or one of the cards that I already showed you has a number 2 on it, and I don't know if that's significant, whether this was sort of what she was like in 1898. The other one is now her arriving at Portland. Maybe they were both available. But the writing on them is different. This just says, as it was in 1898, and the other says it's taken the day after the Battle of Santiago, July 3rd, 1898. The first official visitor cards showed the same image. In fact, all of them showed the identical image. The first one, the one I call version 1, I have no idea of the date, except that it's so similar to those commercial postcards. I think that this was the first experiment. And the main difference is that now on the back of the card, it has some basic information about the Battleship Oregon. And that particular visitor card also is a very thin stock. It certainly wouldn't survive going through the mail. And I suspect they may have printed a few of them to test out what it might be. I don't know, but I'm grateful to have it. And I'm just guessing it's version 1, the earliest version. Version 2 and 3 are very similar. Mainly it's this has the italic writing, the extended E, and then the rose, the Portland rose, is smaller and larger. All of these have some font differences on the back. One of them has slightly different wording. They're kind of interesting in that regard, but I'm just not going to point them all out. And then the 4th version is very much like the first version. I've only seen one copy of either one, and there's no date on it. And all I know is that version 4 was issued while she was still under the Broadway Bridge, which would have been 1925 to 1938. the most common version is probably version 2. And the next advancement in for collectors started in 1930 with an event in Portland called Marine Day, which was sponsored by local businessmen that were involved in the shipping industry around its area. And what was put on covers, this is a typical Marine Day cover, was this little rectangular rubber stamp that said Battleship Oregon, Portland, Oregon, and then it was signed by Cora Thompson, the curator. And besides just, there were almost every one of these Marine Day things are unique. And one of them is actually depicts the Battleship Oregon. I've seen a couple of copies of this. It's not a very common commercial cachet. And as I put out here, I think it might even be the first commercial cachet of Oregon. There were some earlier covers, even when she was an active ship, that you could call a cachet. But as far as done for collectors in more than, for where they made several of them, this might be the first one. That's my theory. I had fun with it at any rate. Later on, you'll see that there are different colors. Cora Thompson signed covers most of the time. And then the last 2 color examples, she really didn't sign at those times. Wondering where that cachet image came from, it dawned on me that it looked very similar to the postcard that had come out earlier depicting the arrival at Portland. And sure enough, that's exactly what it is. They enhanced some of the lines here, but otherwise it matches up just perfectly. The rectangular Battleship Oregon rubber stamp was also available upon request. And in December 1932, which is only 2 or 3 months after the USCS was formed, Dean Bartlett up in Seattle put a blurb in the bulletin, as it was called at that time, that said, if you write to the Battleship Oregon, they've got a little cachet they'll send you. Just send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Cora Thompson. And so I started looking for things that would be a cachet by request, and I found this one. I know that there's a similar one to it that exists. This is the earliest one I know, the November 1932. And then there's the one with the cachet, which is really pretty interesting. Instead of Cora Thompson signing right with it, she signs down at the bottom, and they put the rubber stamp in the middle, and Edward Bryan adds this cachet. Whether he drew it himself, I don't know. I suspect he did, since I think I see EEB right here. Edward Bryan was quite a collector and had a history of in philatelics at that time in the Northwest that it's hard to beat. He came to the Portland area before World War I, and he founded the society that is now the Oregon Stamp Society, of which I'm a member. And then in the late 20s, he moved to Albany, Oregon. He founded another stamp organization there. He was very active in many things and very important person for depictions of the Battleship Oregon. The reason I say that this was done in July 33, about the time he borrowed the rubber stamp, is because that rubber stamp was used on cachets that he made for the visit in Portland of the frigate Constitution. He used them on this set of 3, which I think personally are some of the very best Constitution cachets that were done on the entire tour. And they called them the double caches. They even said that term in the newspaper articles that talked about it. And I thought he positioned it in a very clever way. This one is a rubber stamp, and he left a little slot there to put it in. He left the same sort of slot on these two, which are printed caches. And they're multicolored. So these were very, very nicely done. He also used it on the day that the Constitution left Portland, this time using it sideways. And this was the farewell cachet. I put the little ticket on here because I ran across this. It said Old Ironsides Excursion, Portland. So I did a little research on that. And during the visit of the Constitution, they ran trains, special trains, mostly from the Willamette Valley, going as far as Roseburg, even further, to run people up to Portland to visit the Constitution. And in this part, it says, besides seeing the Constitution, you're going to be given badges that will entitle you to free admission to Battleship Oregon. So they combined the experience of seeing the Constitution with seeing the Oregon, which I thought was neat because it goes along with the double cachet idea. And the final time we see that rectangular rubber stamp is just a couple months later in October 1933 with the 40th anniversary of the Battleship Oregon. Again, Edward Bryan did these, and he used 3 different rubber stamps, and he varied the color. So there's all, this one is red, purple, red. This one is gray, red, gray. And there's several other combinations I've seen. Unfortunately, these are the only 2 that I have. So I'm on the lookout to find more if they're around. And then this postcard is quite interesting because it's addressed to Edward Bryan in Albany, and it's written by Cora Thompson saying, please send me the rubber stamp back. She wants it. And but we never saw it again. So the reason that she never signed those during the Constitution visit up through the 40th anniversary is that she didn't have possession of it. Obviously, Bryan had possession of it. My suspicion is that it may have broken because we never see it again. It's also interesting that she uses a version 2 of the visitor card to send this to him. The last reference to Oregon on Constitution covers was done in March when Constitution was then in San Diego and leaving for the Panama Canal and to finish her tour. And instead of the rubber stamp that he no longer apparently had, he just inserted Battleship Oregon as part of the cachet. I don't really know why he bothered with these. There's Oregon really had nothing to do with her leaving San Diego at that point, other than it was, I guess, a good excuse to make another cachet because these were very popular at the time. In July of 1934, the USS Oregon chapter number 22 was formed. And just a few days after that, the USS Houston visited Portland. And most of us are familiar with this cachet in the lower left that was done by Myron McCamley. And then occasionally you'll see this one that depicts the Oregon inside this circle and flag and whatever that artwork is. And I did not realize that that was an Edward Bryan cachet until I happened to notice again that this image was carved out of the rubber stamp he'd used before, and then he put it inside this circle. He used this empty circle on another cache for the USS Dallas later on, and then stamped something else inside the middle. So there's no doubt that it's Edward Bryan that did that. It's even listed on the Naval Cover Museum. I think it's a really interesting cover just because it has the image of Oregon. About 6 weeks after the Oregon USCS chapter was formed, they changed the name to the USCS Battleship Oregon chapter number 22, and they commemorated the event by making a cachet that says this is the first meeting, first USCS meeting on board the Battleship Oregon. And the chapter was rather unique at that time because it was the only USCS chapter actually held on board a ship. There was one exception. Was it the Pennsylvania? There was a ship where the USCS chapter were members of the actual battleship. Might have been the Pennsylvania. I just noticed it the other day, and now I can't remember. Whether or not these special caches were just for the people present or just for the new members, I'm not sure. I've only seen a couple of them. This one is to Joseph Formick. He's a collector in Salem who was a known member, and but the other one is addressed to Bartley, who was in Seattle. But a lot of the Oregon chapter members were formerly with the Seattle chapter, and then they split off when they formed this. So they could have been a courtesy. And the next advancement was just the following month when the new Battleship Oregon chapter started sponsoring its own caches, which can usually be told quite readily by the use of a chapter rubber stamp that says that it's the Battleship Oregon chapter number 22, berthed at Portland, Oregon. Different colors are seen. Almost all of these also have the name of Louis Dicing, who was the cache director up until the mid-1937. And when they actually started this first cache, they did a spectacular job. 3 different variations, one of the USS Astoria, the USS Portland, and then one from the city. And when you see these, there's no mixing and matching. All the Astoria ones are red, all the Portland ones are blue, and all the city ones are the combined color. They also began producing caches for events. The Thanksgiving 1934, they used the General Pershing, which was a commercial ship, and then the Nitro was for Christmas, and then the New Year's. All 3 of these were probably done by Albert Hannaford, who was what's the word? Like a graphic artist or draftsman for the city of Portland. And he produced some nice caches. He didn't always put his name on it. This one happens to be addressed to Edward Peake, who was another member of the Oregon chapter. And they have this is what the typical back of a cover looks like. Technically, anything produced by the Battleship Oregon chapter honors the battleship in some way. Unfortunately, they're not always obvious to see. The rubber stamp had a little nib on it right here in the early versions. It had 179, which was McCamley's number. And then beginning in May, that's the earliest one I've seen, they've taken that off. So now it's just the stamp and more perfectly round. These are just some examples of what some of the front of the caches look like. These all have the rubber stamp on the back. The chapter also produced a large number of maritime covers. In early USCS history, maritime covers were as popular as Navy covers. And the head of the Oregon chapter for much of the time was Myron Camley, who also had a position on the national level of being director of the maritime type of covers. So he pushed that a lot, and they produced a lot. They're not always obvious as whether they're him or national or chapter covers, but these four at least have the rubber stamp on the back. I could show you many more, but I don't have time. In fact, during late 1935, almost everything you see are maritime covers, and I stumbled across this one that's actually a Navy ship, and an Oregon chapter cachet that has, there's a similar one I've seen, but this is actually a new discovery on my end, and then that's the back of the cover that confirms what it is. Another interesting discovery, so to speak, was a maritime ship cover that the motor ship India that was at Portland in December 1935, which is why they have the Christmas cachet. She was on her way to Europe, and she didn't get this back in the mail until February 1936. But the most interesting thing is that it's addressed to Cora Thompson, care of the Battleship Oregon. So it also has the rubber stamp on the back, as I recall. But I had no idea that Cora Thompson had any covers. And then I realized later that there are some others out there. I bought a batch at a show not too long ago. I didn't even realize till I got home and was going through things that one of them was addressed to Cora Thompson. So I think she had some interest in covers because the chapter was meeting regularly on her ship, and she made note of it. She was great for advertising. She was always promoting the ship to be used for dances, banquets, events of various kinds. And there were organizations other than the Battleship Oregon chapter that regularly met on board, often veterans groups. You Asiatic fleet people probably know this cachet. It was a new one for me to be associated with the Battleship Oregon chapter. Somebody added a little Crosby thing with the gold stars. So this is what the cachet would have looked like before they added the picture. And then for me, trying to document these covers, it's frustrating that here you see the same date, different Asiatic ship, same cachet. This one has the chapter stamp on the back and this one doesn't. So they were really inconsistent, and it makes it really difficult for documenting. A popular one in 36, I mean, popular today, I'm not sure how many of these were made, but USS Utah with a cachet for a Memorial Day. And I think it's more popular today because Utah was sunk at Pearl Harbor. So it's kind of a sad cachet. It took me a while to find one of these, and it was quite expensive. Another Asiatic cachet are the 4th of July USS Stewart. And it's an Oregon chapter cachet, is marked on the back. In fact, it says it on the front too. So all you Asiatic guys, have you ever seen another 4th of July with the firecracker cachet other than the USS Stewart? That's the only one I've seen. I guess you're all muted, so you can tell me later. One of the big events in Portland in 35, 36 following years was Fleet Week. That kind of sort of went along with the Rose Festival. And the Oregon chapter did a really great job on some different kinds of cachets. I'm just going to show you an example here. They had this square example that was used in several different years. This is the first year that it showed up. There are color variations. There's even 2 more colors I'm not showing you. And then this is probably my favorite of the 1936 ones that came in black or red. One thing about these caches is if you see, they didn't mix and match. If you see the USS Dewey, it's always going to be this cache in red. If you see the Monaghan, it's always going to be this cache in black. There were other organizations that met on board the ship. One of them was the Navy's Mother Club, the Battleship Oregon Club number 6. And I'll be darned if there wasn't a cache made. Don't know who did it. I suspect it might have been McCamley. There's a similar cache. Actually, it's a M. Murridge did a cache for the Mothers Club up in Tacoma around the same time, but she clearly didn't do this one. Also, the Wigand had a series of ship things often associated with USS Seattle in 1937. And one of them they did was for the Battleship Oregon, which was nice. Okay, back to the Oregon chapter covers. In 1937, they also were quite innovative. One of my favorites is this with the little biplanes. I think there were 3 different ships, at least 2 different colors, as I recall, that they produced. This is a common cache you see with Portland Fleet Week, but very few of them actually have the rubber stamp on the back. This one does. Another innovative cache. So, as you see, sometimes they'll show Battleship Oregon right on the cache. This one does not. They also produced a postcard that was available either as a unique postcard or as part of where it folds out. They've got 10 different postcards there. I'm not sure this is 1937. It's the Indianapolis, and she visited a couple of times, but it's right in that range. What's interesting is that somebody was standing right on the Broadway Bridge where I was looking out. I could almost see the spot, and that's what it would have looked like standing on the Broadway Bridge. And there's similar photographs in newspapers with that angle, and boy, would have loved to have seen that. The 1937 continued. They had the USS Astoria. That's the only time the Astoria ever visited there. And my friend Mike Brock I was grateful he sold me that cover to add. And but it was during July 1937 that Louis Dicing left, and the rubber stamp disappeared with him. So late July is about the end of what you see for the rubber stamp to identify that this is a Oregon chapter cover, which depicts the Battleship Oregon. Now, there were a couple of examples that I've seen where the rubber stamp came in August or September, but in both the cases that I've seen, they were caches that would have been mailed out to the ship, and it probably had the rubber stamp on it already. And some of those later ones you see also are in green. In 1938, continuing, it's really difficult to identify covers that are identified or depict or represent the Battleship Oregon. They reused this cache several different times, and they did that with the Tulsa. This was one that I wasn't aware of that popped up. And then this one for the Rigel in 38 at least says that it's the USCS chapter 22. So even that's a little bit of a cheat in saying that it represents the ship. It does if you know what chapter 22 is. The same with these. It says the chapter name, which infers the Battleship Oregon chapter. But and there were a lot of other really neat caches they produced in 38 that we know were produced by the chapter. But again, my exhibit in this and what I'm doing today is trying to focus on depictions of the ship. I did squeeze this one in though, because it's just the red variation of that. I thought it was a really especially beautiful. Found that in a box of stuff I had, didn't even know I had it, didn't know what it was. When so just as the Oregon chapter ended, they added a new Battleship Oregon chapter rubber stamp, and it's really neat. This is the only time they ever used it, was in September 38, and it kind of looks like a Type 3 cancel that we know well. The event that this was for was to move the ship from the east side of the river across and down about a mile to a new berthing area. At the time, the Spanish-American veterans were having their encampment national convention, and the dedication of the Oregon at her new mooring place was the big event of the day for them as well. So the Battleship Oregon chapter really outdid themselves and produced 3 caches that are spectacular. And just like they started with the USS Astoria and the Portland and the city of Portland, they ended that as well. These are the last ones that I could say definitely were produced by the Battleship Oregon chapter. The Veterans Convention that was going on produced some other interesting things depicting the Oregon. This is you see this every once in a while. I don't think it's really rare, but it's a very colorful postcard showing the main on the front, tells about the encampment, and on the back, it has the Battleship Oregon. During the year of 1938, you see other depictions of the 40th anniversary of the Spanish-American War. And I'd seen these, and I used to see this little emblem and wondered, there's the Maine, there's Teddy Roosevelt. Could that be Oregon? And I wasn't sure until I actually saw this sticker. And there it is. It confirms that's Teddy Roosevelt and famous old Oregon. It's just that when they used the image for a cache, they didn't have room for the writing, so they modified it. So when you see these caches, that's the Oregon. And there are quite a number of them. The Dewey is one ship they used quite often because Dewey in the Spanish-American War is well known. And I didn't realize that they used ships like the Pennsylvania on one, and this one's even the USS Arizona. I wasn't aware of. The only one that I've ever seen about the Oregon, I've seen 2 of them. They're both on postcards instead of covers, with the same kind of, I guess that's a rubber stamp maybe that he made. I don't know how he did that. And he had them done, postmarked in Cuba on July 3rd, which is the Battle of Santiago anniversary. I kind of would have preferred something along the lines of this, and maybe something does exist. They also did one for the reunion week itself, and there's the Oregon at its new boardage. And there was a banquet on board the Oregon by the Wisconsin contingent of Spanish-American War veterans. Inside, there was a place, it gives the menu, I didn't show the whole thing, and it gives a place for the captain of the USS Oregon to sign. Probably these old Army guys didn't realize that Oregon wasn't an active ship anymore, and she didn't have a captain. So they grabbed this guy, William Fiedler, who was a caretaker on the Oregon. He worked with Cora Thompson. I did a little research on him. And it looks like he started about 1932 and worked up until the time the Oregon was left in 1942. Happened to even find a photo of him. And so this shows the mooring area of Oregon. Also last month, I was on a little boat cruise for someone on our church had a 50th anniversary, and they took a whole bunch of people all over up and down the river. And we unexpectedly crossed under the Hawthorne Bridge with both directions So I grabbed my camera. I was thinking it was this green area was where the Oregon had moored, but that corresponds to this in the photo. And I should have kept shooting because it's the beginning of what is now a little mooring area on this side of the little bump that I should have been focusing on. But anyway, you get an idea what it's looked like to go under the bridge, this direction, and seeing this and where the Oregon was moored. It was fun. After the demise of the Battleship Oregon chapter, there were not a lot of references. McCamley did this cover in November 1940, which has a new Armistice Day rubber stamp. And it really is an official cover that mentions the Oregon directly, but he did that personally. You do see use of the earlier rubber stamp or the earlier cachets done by the chapter. He did these in 39, 40, 41, and again after the war. And then one time only, this final Berthed Oregon rubber stamp from the chapter with the center gouged out appears on the USS Naval, which was in Portland to be modified for Navy use. So Robert Kirchgraber, who was an Oregon chapter member, worked with McCamley on several different covers around this time. And I think that he either was given the rubber stamp or took it, or who knows. But I've never seen that stamp on any other cover. In 1942, there were these famous ancestor series that, I don't know, there were 6 or 8 of them: the Constitution, the Panay, and the Oregon, just to name 3, appear. They were all produced about the same time. This one was done in April 42. And it's just a really spectacular cachet of the Oregon. And I like the red color. This is a photograph of Oregon. On the back, it says it's Easter 1942, which would be April. And that's what she looked like from the stern looking forward. And the last day that Oregon was open to the public was on Thanksgiving Day, November 26, 1942. Victor Smith, who was Oregon Stamp Society, later president of the Oregon Stamp Society, was in charge of some upcoming cachets that were going to be done on December 7th. I'll show you in a minute. But he also took the time to have this cachet made, just handwritten out, saying it's the last day of that the ship was open to the public. And he addressed it to himself. But why would the Oregon have been open to the public on Thanksgiving Day? That's a mystery to me. This was the cachet that Victor was the cachet director for. Very commonly seen cachet that had an insert inside, which was done by an artist in Oregon, immigrant artist, who did this when Oregon was still over by the Broadway Bridge. So it's an earlier etching. And it's just a wonderfully done cachet, though. Sponsored by the Oregon Stamp Society. I've seen it with the newsprint over a patriotic cachet just pasted on there. I've seen it with a mute cancel. There are different ways. I just sort of picked things up as they went along. The president of the Oregon Stamp Society in 1942, when this was done, was Arthur Roberts, who had been in the old Battleship Oregon chapter. So there's connections all over. The ship itself remained at Portland until the end of February 1943. And you can see that the front mast is missing right here. And now is on the waterfront of Portland even today. I don't like going down there. It's Portland city of Portland is not a nice place to walk around anymore. They started demolishing her about 40 miles down the river at a place called Kalama. And they got partway done, and the Navy decided that they could use the hull of the Oregon for an ammunition barge. So they finished transitioning her to an ammunition barge. And I've seen references in the war diaries of her being over in the area of Guam, often at Apra Harbor, away from most of the rest of the ships, but with a guard ship like the Coast Guard cutter Tupelo was often mentioned. There was even an incident mentioned in the war diary of Tupelo, how when they wanted to show a movie, so they went on board the Oregon on the big flat top where they could look more, see the movie easier. And one of the civilian workers fell into one of the holds, fell about 35 feet and was killed. Anyway, after the war, she was left in Guam, and eventually in the mid-1950s was towed off to Japan, and they did finish scrapping her. The fact that they started scrapping her in Kalama, you see even today all kinds of bits and pieces of the Battleship Oregon offered, often from local sources. Parts of her decking, a porthole I've seen, a door, a table from the wardroom, things like that. Even just in the last couple of years, they found the two stacks not far from where her last mooring was, laying by now abandoned shipyard. And it looked like they were going to be destroyed, but the last I heard is they did find a museum or something that would take them. They're pretty big, like 40 feet long and 15 feet diameter. So it's not the kind of thing everybody necessarily wants. And I think that's it.
Very nice, Lloyd.
Lloyd, that was great.
Anybody
Good
have
job,
any?
Lloyd.
Oh, thanks.
Amazing, well done.
Very good information. Very impressive with all the things you've found.
So did anybody know of any July 4th with the firecracker cache other than the USS Stewart?
I will have to look.
Yeah.
And what year was that, Lloyd?
I think it was 36.
I will look and email you if I find anything.
That would be fun to. As a side project, I'm also documenting the chapter covers from the Battleship Oregon chapter. So whether I own the covers or not, I'm documenting them for something that I'll produce someday, probably in PDF format or upload to the website, something like that.
Okay.
Henry, and enjoyed your presentation very much, and I was writing down dates as fast as I could, and I'll see if I have any more to add to your census on these.
Great. I've got quite a listing. I put it on a big spreadsheet. I think it was over 300 lines at the last I looked. So I only showed a small portion of what's actually been documented.
Wonderful presentation, consistent with your penchant for great research. Always a pleasure to read anything you write and see anything you do.
Oh, thank you, Mel. I'll be seeing you in Sacramento.
I sure hope so.
Yeah.
Had some side effects after the hip replacement surgery. So we're overcoming some of that stuff now.
Well, good luck to you, Mel.
Thank you. Don't get old.
Oh, hey, it's still better than the alternative. Lloyd, I did have one question, actually. I noticed something from the beginning. You were talking something about Cora's signing things, and you had two up, and I was wondering, was one of those a rubber stamp and one an actual signature? Because the handwriting was no longer the same.
She didn't use a rubber stamp on her signature.
Oh, she didn't. Okay.
I have looked, yeah, her signature varied a little bit. I noticed that, especially during my working days when I signed a lot of things,
Yes.
I had about 3 signatures. One was practically a scribble, one was moderately okay, and the other was a careful signature. Just depends on what it is and how rushed I was. So. Yeah, she was an interesting lady. She was married, was very involved with Spanish American War veterans and other veterans groups and organizations. So her being in charge of the Oregon was just one of several things. They were actually state employees. So. Sadly, the public kind of forgot about the Oregon. World War I dimmed the memories of Spanish American War, and the children in the 1930s didn't care a whit about the Spanish American War at that point. And then World War II came. Nobody knew who cared anymore. All the politicians wanted to do is talk about the expense and the trouble of maintaining the battleship. So.
Yeah, well, the Hartford sank at its mooring, so it's not the first one to go that way.
Right.
Okay, anybody else?
I have a comment to John Noble before he goes, if he would stay on for a second.
I think these programs are very worthwhile, and I look forward to them whenever I can. And I think it's a great way to reach a broader segment of our organization. I'm sorry that not even more people are not participating.
Well, we've been recording them, and I think Steve can tell us that I know I've gotten some emails that say that they couldn't make the meeting, but they watched the recordings later. And I think, Steve, you've said you've gotten some of those too.
Yeah, just about every time I get 2 or 3 emails from different people saying they watched the recording, but
Yeah,
not sure why they don't attend the meeting, but they do look at the recordings.
well, I imagine that people have a lot to do on the weekends, but the fact that you're recording and making them available, I think, is outstanding.
Steve, one thing that we could probably do is create a little page or tab on the website, and then just list the links to the various recordings.
The links die, so.
Oh, they do. What's
Yeah.
the time period that you have any idea?
We fill up our storage on Zoom, so it's dependent on that.
Zoom related storage. Darn.
My intent someday when I get some time is to make a YouTube channel for USCS and post all of them there.
That would be fun. But somebody'd have to know how to do YouTube, because I don't. Okay, well, we don't have a meeting next month. Well, yeah, still next month. In August, we don't because of the convention. But then we'll be back in September, and Henry Sweets will be giving us a presentation.
And that's September 17th.
What's the subject?
Okay.
Subject is going to be the USS Hannibal.
Oh,
Not named after Hannibal, Missouri, but it's because of the same name. I've been very interested in it and have an exhibit that I've shown, and I'll be picking pages from the exhibit and talking about the history of a ship that was commissioned in 1898 and decommissioned in 1944. So she had a long history with a lot of different postmarks.
Oh,
Sounds fun.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Lloyd.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thanks
it.
very much. Thanks,
Enjoyed it.
Lloyd.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Yep, not a problem.
Great.
See you
Outstanding.
next time.
Cheers.
See you soon.